Thank you very much, Amid. That was Amid Sanjari playing a piece that he composed especially for this evening and for the intro to this event. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Pani Farvad, a faculty member in the Schools of Public Engagement. Thank you. I'm delighted to see you all here and to invite you to this rich and informative and packed evening where we're going to be speaking about some of the current issues that we're dealing with in the Iranian context. To open the event and to kick things off, I'd love to invite Melanie Hart to the stage. Melanie's a Senior Vice President for Equity, Inclusion and Social Justice and our Chief Diversity Officer at the New School. Welcome, Melanie. Thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm from a call and response culture. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. Hi, I'm Melanie Hart. I'm the Senior Vice President for Equity. I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice and the Chief Diversity Officer, as well as the Senior Legal and Policy Advisor for the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. If Derek was here, make sure you tell him I said that. He says I never give that title. I want to thank Pani Farvad for inviting me to participate in this wonderful event tonight, a very necessary event, particularly tonight on International Women's Day. We are having a really important conversation on an extraordinary day, and I think while circumstances prevented us from doing it earlier, I think there's a reason why today was a great day for us to do this. I also want to welcome everyone on behalf of President McBride and Provost White, who are not here, but are certainly supporting this event as well, so I certainly want to welcome you on their behalf. In many ways, we are here today because of Mahsa Amini. On September 16, 2022, Iranian Kurdish Mahsa Amini died as a result of police brutality after she was arrested by the Religious Morality Police of Iran for supposedly wearing improper head covering. Mahsa Amini's death sparked a national woman-led protest that was later adopted and supported on a national and even a global scale. We gather here tonight to grieve together, to learn together, and to grow together. We gather tonight to challenge ourselves to understand the context for this women's-led social justice movement and to interrogate our individual and collective responsibility. We are all differently situated. Some are diasporic members of the Iran and Kurdish communities, while others of us are allies, and we gather to explore our roles and responsibilities. Here at the New School, where our mission charges us to prepare students to understand and contribute to a rapidly changing society and to contribute to making the world a better and more just place, we must start from the premise that there is much for all of us to learn. At the New School, we offer an equity and social justice frame that uses a domestic epistemology in a global context and a global epistemology in a domestic context. This means more than anything that we must understand that our language and our frame for understanding justice and what constitutes a more just world is not exclusively defined by a single narrative or perspective. It must be understood and led by those whose understanding and life experiences are defined and shaped by recognizing a community's ability to be a sacred and expert source of knowledge for determining liberation, freedom, and justice. And the role and purview of allies, of which I consider myself, is to first seek to understand, which is what we hope will be enabled tonight. We must understand the social, political, economic, and cultural context in which communities identify their models and aspirations for justice. No people are a monolith, despite shared identities. Identities are intersectional, and individuals are unique. Yet social movements for justice offer an opportunity for individuals to come together to define greater community social good. We are excited to learn and to hear what this looks like from the perspective of Iranian women and others who are coming together tonight as we think about this social justice movement. Our other goal as allies here tonight is to find appropriate and respectful ways to continue to increase our knowledge and to find culturally competent ways to lend our support. Often our definition of help is socially and culturally constructed. And so it's often most effective to ask the communities that we seek to help, what is it they need from us to feel supported? It is in that context that I come together and we come together as a community tonight to understand community, to understand the needs, to understand the move for advancement and how we may support that. Some of the individuals in this auditorium tonight are Iranian citizens, others come from there, and others can never go home again. What is our responsibility to make sure we're supporting each and every one of those identities? How do we all come together tonight and moving forward? I welcome you. I implore us to ask this question: what are the revolutionary possibilities in Iran? That is what we're gathered tonight to do. I thank you, Pani. I thank you all for who will be here tonight to engage in this endeavor and know that this is just the beginning. Happy International Women's Day, and thank you.
Not gonna lie, getting a little emotional already. Thank you so much, Melanie, for that really powerful opening and for really holding the space for us and our intentions for what's to come in the next sort of hour and a bit. As you will see in the program that I hope all of you picked up coming in, we have a sequence of speakers, performances and discussions coming up for you. And sort of the goal for the evening is sort of multi-pronged, but one of the things we'd like to do is both showcase the sort of complex, ancient and diverse history of Iran and the Iranian people, both in the past and in the present, as well as talk about what's happening right now and to imagine what the future may hold, a more socially just and a more inclusive and equitable and plural society. So to get us started, I would like to invite Sam Nagahdar to the stage, who's going to start us off with a poem. If you know anything about Persians, you will know that we love our poetry. So we're going to read, she's going to do a reading for us that really ties into the title of this program, The Fall of Zahak. Zahak is a legendary king in Persian history as featured in the famous Persian book Shahnameh, for Persian text Shahnameh. Written by Ferdowsi around 10,000 AD, Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings, is considered the longest poem to have ever been written, go the Persians, and is the most important Iranian text capturing Persian history and culture and sustaining Farsi as a language. Welcome, Sam. Where are you? Oh, come on.
Hello, everyone. چو ضحاک شد بر جهان شهریار، بر او سالیان انجمن شد هزار. سراسر زمانه بدو گشت باز، برآمد بر این روزگار دراز. نهان گشت کردار فرزانگان، پراکنده شد کام دیوانگان. هنرخوار شد جادوی ارجمند، نهان راستی آشکارا گزند. شده بر بدی دست دیوان دراز، نبودی ز نیکی سخن جز به راز. ندانست جز کژی آموختن، جز از کشتن و غارت و سوختن. چنان بود که هر شب دو مرد جوان، چه کهتر چه از تخمه پهلوان. خورشگر ببردی به ایوان شاه، همی ساختی راه درمان شاه. بکشتی و مغزش بپرداختی، مران اژدها را خورش ساختی. Zahak was a man of virtue, but one day he got caught up in his lust for power. Then he asked Ahriman, the devil, to grant him wish of ruling the world. Ahriman asked him to kill his father, and after doing that, he kissed his shoulder in appreciation. Then two deadly and brutal snakes grew up of his shoulder. From there on, Zahak sat on the throne for 1,000 years, obeyed by the entirety of the world. During this lengthy period, the customs of the wise were out of vogue, the lust of madmen flourished, all virtue was despised, vile vice and sorcery esteemed. Right lost to sight, disaster manifested, while demons accomplished their evil purposes, and no man spoke of good unless by stealth. The only teaching that he knew was destructive, to massacre, to pillage, and to burn. During his role, every night 2 young men of elevated or humble born were taken to the palace by the chef, who, having slaughtered them, extracted their brains to feed to the snakes to ease the monarch's anguish. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Sam. So this is my opportunity to provide a little bit of context and background and scaffolding for the discussion that will ensue. I have the rather ambitious task or attempt to provide you as much information and historical context of about like 4,000 years in 15 minutes. So I'll do my best. But basically, in order to set the scene for the rest of the program, I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about what brings us here. How did we get here? So, modern-day Iran and what constitutes modern-day Iranians is the culmination of a diverse range of cultures, classes, ethnicities, and religions, often with competing interests, norms, and ideologies. Yet, at various points within history, very heterogeneous groups have lived in great harmony, such as during the Persian Empire, or have come together to work towards a shared goal, such as in the 1979 revolution. While at times very heterogeneous groupings are vehemently split on very specific social and political matters. What is happening today in Iran is not too dissimilar from some of the polarized sociopolitical contexts we find ourselves in the US and other parts of the globe. Indeed, Iran's history, and particularly in the 20th century onwards, represents an ongoing ideological, sociocultural, political, and legal battle over the following: the place of religion and secularization within society, the place of modernization and traditionalism, the place of capitalism and socialism or leftist politics, the place of imperialism and nationalism, and the role of the West, the role that the West should play in matters related to Iran. And of course, men's and women's roles within society, as well as the meaning of gender, sexuality, human rights, freedom, autonomy, and democracy. In a very short time that I have with you, I hope to pull out three themes within Iranian history and culture that hopefully scaffolds and situates us for going forward. First, I want to historically situate Iran, Iranians, and the place of religion within the Iranian context. Secondly, I want to talk about feminist issues and the women's movement within Iran. And lastly, I will briefly go over the backdrop to the 2002 protests, which bring us here today. The history of Iran is intertwined with the history of a larger region known as Greater Iran, as displayed on the slide here. It is home to some of the world's earliest archaeological artifacts and one of the world's oldest continuous major civilizations, and to one of the world's most expansive and most effective ancient empires. At its height, the Persian Empire, that is the Achaemenid Empire, spanned the region from West Asia to East and South Asia, being kind of cradled by what is southern Russia today and the Persian and the Gulf of Oman to the south. To this day, the Persian Empire is considered one of the biggest and the most sophisticated empires, with a hierarchical and well-organized and expansive administrative system where it could lead and a range of different peoples under its rule. It not only displayed great humanity and tolerance towards those under its rule, typically allowing folks to hold on to their customs, religions, and live alongside them peacefully, but also was the source of profound scientific, artistic, and cultural generation. In addition, it is clear that from the beginning, philosophy, spirituality, mysticism, poetry, and the greater questions of human existence are central and remain central to Iranian life. Once a major empire, Iran has endured various invasions by the Macedonians, the Arabs, the Turks, and the Mongols. And during this time, and through many battles, it has sought to continually reassert its evolving national identity, culminating in a distinct political and cultural entity that we see today. If we look at some of the key moments of political and religious transition in Persian history, this tension between indigenous and imported or imposed norms and ideologies becomes clearer. The early Persians were initially Zoroastrian in faith when it comes to religion. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest organized religions, and the first with a dualistic cosmology of good and evil within the framework of monotheism. With its belief in free will and judgment after death, conception of heaven and hell, angels and demons, it is thought to have influenced many subsequent religions and philosophical systems, including Abrahamic religions, Northern Buddhism, and Greek philosophy. It was the state religion up until the Arab Muslim conquest of Persia, which then led to the imposition of Sunni Islam. Then, during 1501, Iranian rule came back to the Iranians under the Safavid regime, and this is when Safavid dynasty, and this is where Shia Islam becomes the dominant and leading tradition to this day. When we look at Iran during the 20th century, it certainly is a dramatic narrative. Bring this up. A key moment in modern Iran is our constitutional revolution in the early 20th century, which led to the establishment of a parliament in Iran. And this revolution opened the way up for fundamental modernization changes within the Iranian context. Many groups fought to be heard and have their say in how this change should happen, but the whole of Iran was irrecoverably changed by it. Following this, in 1908, the discovery of petroleum in Kazakhstan by the British Empire made them very interested in Iranian affairs from then on. Following this, another key event is the 1921 military coup that established Reza Shah, initially known as Reza Khan, a military officer who would come to then rule Iran for the next 20 years. This started the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah was there for about 16 years until 1941, when he was forced to abdicate by the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. During this time, he established an authoritarian government that valued nationalism, militarism, secularization, and anti-communism, combined with strict censorship and state propaganda. Reza Shah introduced many socioeconomic reforms, reorganized the army, the government, and its finances. His attempts at modernization were seen by some as very welcomed, but criticized by others as too fast, too westernized, too superficial, and with his regime showcasing a time of oppression, corruption, and lack of authenticity, and the type of security that was typical of a police state. Some of the examples of his modernizing reforms include banning the hijab during the 1930s, requiring folks to use chairs within mosques, preferring that folks wore westernized clothing. Women and men were encouraged to and allowed to congregate freely, which violated the gender mixing rules of Islamic ideology. He changed the name of Persia to Iran and purified the Farsi language by removing over 2,500 Arab words and replacing them with Greek and Latin words. He also added the Shia or Khorshid flag in the middle of the flag, the lion and the sun, which symbolizes his opposition to Islam or an Islamic rule. Many of the new laws and regulations created resentment among the devout Muslim and clergy. Tensions boiled over during this time, and many folks started to, including the Bazaris and villagers, started to protest his movements. his son took over, Mohammad Reza took over in 1941, and initially he had a hands-off approach, but by 1949, his rule had become, he'd increased his political power, and by 1953, we see a CIA-backed coup supported by the British MI6, which got rid of the democratically elected Mossadegh Prime Minister Mossadegh, and gave full power to the Shah over Iran. During this time, we see an era of tension, escalating tension between the Shah's regime, the increasing power of his secret police, the Zahak, and the will of the people who came together from various different backgrounds, ideologies, and convictions to resist the rule of the Pahlavi rule. This culminated in the 1979 revolution in Iran. While many Iranians were united in their fight against the imperialism, hypercapitalism, and westernization that they saw was happening in their country, they came from very, very diverse backgrounds. It was the rich, it was the poor, it was men, it was women, it was urban, it was rural, it was students, intellectuals, merchants, and so on. But they all had one goal in mind, and many of them saw what would come after the revolution quite differently. However, as these things often go, when the revolution happened and the Shah left Iran, there was a power vacuum that was very quickly grabbed by the clergy and the Islamic conservatives. They were very organized in organizing themselves to fill that power vacuum. One of the things that I find really fascinating about the Iranian Revolution as well is there are chants that sound very similar to some of the things that we're hearing today. For example, one of the chants you would hear during the 1979 and 1978 was Istiqlal, Azadi, Jomhuriye Islami, which means independence, freedom, and the Islamic State. And to me, it's such a very, it sounds so contradictory and kind of like hypocritical to be fighting for freedom through the guise of an Islamic state. But that was some of the rhetoric and ideology that was at play, and Islam, for better or worse, was used as an ideology for freedom. But that's not how it's transpired, and that's not what's happening today. So the unrest that we see in Iran and the difficulties that we are facing come from this tension between what people fought for and what they ended up with. And initially, earlier on in the post-revolutionary years, the Iranian people had a bit more patience with this. They were like, all right, well, let's see what we can do under this ideology. But over the years, it's become really clear, not only through various profound, challenging events within the Iranian context, including the 8-year war with Iraq, that the situation has got worse and more dire, and rather than becoming more open, plural, or free, it's got more and more authoritarian, restrictive, and brutal. And as you can see, the Iranian people, there's been this kind of dance of back and forth and a desire to reform what the revolution brought in, and it has not been met with much traction. And these are some of the reasons that we believe we find ourselves here today. People are fed up. They just cannot put up with any more of the hardline rule within the Iranian system that seems to be getting worse and changing the nature and culture of Iran and the way we typically live and operate. I want to quickly talk about the diversity within Iran before moving further. Diversity in Iran today before moving further. A huge number of Iranians are diasporic for various reasons. It's quite a large country, having up to 90 million, close to 90 million folks. It's a very youthful population. About 50% of the population is under 50. Most people live in urban centres, and there is a diverse ethnic breakdown within Iran, with Persians taking up about 65% of that, but other ethnic minorities also living there. Iran is a highly educated country with almost 90% literacy, and a lot of the folks going to university to pursue university education, and with 60% of university graduates being women. School is compulsory between the ages of 6 and 11 for both boys and girls, while schools remain segregated in terms of when it comes to sex. However, human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of expression in terms of your gender and sexual identity are heavily compromised and or almost non-existent. So, what about women's rights in Iran? Iran has a long history of feminism with an active and vibrant women's movement. To shed light on this context, it is my absolute pleasure to read the preamble from the recently launched Iran's Women's Bill of Rights by Feminist Collective for Women, Life, Freedom, which includes one of our guests tonight, Dr. Mona Tajali, who will tell us a little bit more about this later, but I would like to just read the preamble for you because I think it really beautifully encapsulates and ties into what I've already talked about, but also crystallizing the Iranian women's struggle and the feminist movement within. In Iran, historically in Iran, as elsewhere in the world, multiple legal and cultural institutions have been at work to exclude women from corridors of power and decision-making. In Iran, this trend has largely used religion as a justification, particularly since the establishment of the Safavid dynasty and the integration of religion into the political structure. But this has also intensified rapidly since the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. While women had always tried to find ways to resist the limitations placed upon them at the individual and community levels, it was during the constitutional movement that they joined the national movement towards establishing their citizenry rights and do away with social and legal institutions that reduced women to lesser humans. However, despite their sacrifices, on the eve of the revolution's success in 1911, women's demands were ignored. Decades later, in 1979, hundreds and thousands of women joined another popular revolution in the hope that they would realize a plural democracy. Women wanted to be able to freely decide about their lives and achieve their potential without cultural or legal obstacles. However, the revolutionary forces placed women's demands for equality and justice on the back burner yet again, while the soon-established Islamic theocracy imposed catastrophic social and legal restrictions on women. Women organized as a response. The first mass protest against the Islamic Republic was held by women on 8th of March, 1979, when many poured into the streets to express their opposition to compulsory hijab and the top-down Islamization process. I'm so against it that I can't even say. Despite threats to their lives and freedom, women relentlessly pushed for their rights, often without the support of other forces who claimed they championed democracy. Throughout the past 44 years, women have remained a major force of democracy, social justice, and freedom in Iran. As major actors, women have often organized, mobilized, and demanded gender equality. On numerous occasions, women have also joined forces across the ideological spectrum to express their demand in a more unified way, such as preparing a comprehensive women's charter in 2009 or collectively lobbying male political candidates on greater access to political decision-making. Inside the country, under severe state surveillance, women still work diligently to make social media their platform and commit acts of civil disobedience on a daily basis, while others join labor and environmental movements. All the while, the question of hijab remained among the most contentious subject between the state and its citizens. Daughters of the Revolution Street, by unveiling and peacefully waving their hijab, lodged an open contestation to the state, despite the heavy price awaiting them. The vast majority of women, regardless of their level of religiosity, never really accepted the Islamic gender ideology that denied them their fundamental human rights. And I think one of the challenges we have here is sometimes when we're talking about Islam or the theocratic state within Iran in this way, it can be read as Islamophobic, and that's not what's going on here. I think Islam is not necessarily synonymous with oppression or suppression, but certainly within a patriarchal context and within the current Iranian context, that's what has happened for women. Okay, so given, in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch on what brings us here and to say that we come here to discuss women's rights and the rights of others within Iran who are marginalized, minoritized, and suffer at the hands of the state with brutal force just for wanting greater freedoms and a sense of their own autonomy and human rights. To talk about some of the imagery and the visual aspects of the protests that have been happening in Iran, I'd like to invite to the stage Paria Ahmadi, who's going to talk about her work on the images and the protests that have been happening within Iran.
Thank you all for being here. Okay, great. So before the uprising started in Iran, I was very focused on trying to tell just the story of what I experienced growing up in Iran and just the stories of Iranian families. I was making prints of photographs from my mother's family on the back of carpets. That's my mom in a birthday party dancing, and on the left, it's my uncle during the military service. It was always very, interesting to me how we were kind of living a fragmented identity. You had to act in a certain way when you were in the public space, and you were a totally different person when you were inside. But when I remember very well when I just started hearing about the murder of Mahsa Amini by the morality police, I was so angry, and I was very emotional, and I guessed that there might be some protests coming, but I never knew how massive it was going to be. I remember the last protest that I was in Iran. It was in 2019, in the end of the year, when the government shot our own passenger airplane. And we went to the streets saying chants. I remember going to school, every day. Me and my friends, we were showing the souvenirs we had from the protest, the bruises, and the stories, the signs of the bullets. And now I was here, and then I saw my friends going to the streets just on social media. And I thought I have to do something. I have to tell this story. And at first I didn't know how to because I was away. And this image that says Tehran 1401, which means the current year that we are in, is just a screenshot from me and my mom's video call. And I was trying to collect the images that I was seeing on social media, and I was trying to find a way to just express how important they are to me. And I just wanted to tell the story in a way that the borders of the story are not, I wanted the borders of the story to dissolve. I didn't want to follow a line because I thought if I just follow a line, I will miss a lot of things in the story that I'm trying to tell. So instead I tried to find an element that could be the rhythm for my visual story. And I chose fire. I remember going through social media and just seeing all those images, and at the same time, I was questioning what I can trust. And yeah, I found trust in fire. It was a testimony that something at least had happened. And fire was joy, fire was power, fire was victory, fire was also destruction. Fire was neutral because it just burns everything inside it, and you don't know actually what's actually burned. It burns the memories, it burns the wishes, it burns the sacrifices inside it. And I also just remembered I was looking at some postcards from the Qajar era related to the constitutional revolution. And in that time, the king ordered photographers to take photos of the executions of people and the people who were arrested as a record, so the king would know that this had happened, but also as a way of showing people that this is what happens to you when you try to have a voice. But something amazing happened, and it was that people took those photos and added their poems to the postcards, and they acted differently because these postcards that were circulated among people actually gave them more power to have more of their voice, and the constitutional revolution actually happened in Iran. So I chose fire, and I started making prints of the images that I was collecting. I decided to choose a very slow process because I was kind of bothered by how the speed of the image circulation was so high, and I knew every person, every footage that I could see, someone had risked their life to take it, and I knew that it holds so much, sacrifice and power. So I chose silkscreen, CMYK printing, and I also tried to sometimes add some of the poems that I remembered next to the images. For example, this one says, "Zardi man az to, sorkhi to az man," which translates to, so we have an event in the end of the year called Charshanbe Suri that we make a small fire, we gather around it, or we jump over it, and we sing this poem that, if I just translate it, it's like saying, my yellowness to you, which means the yellow is a metaphor of illness and weakness, and you jump over the fire, and you tell this to the fire that I give you all my weaknesses, all my illnesses, and sorkhiyatu az man, which means your redness, your joy, your power, your health to me. So it's like a relation with the fire that we have. So yeah, and I thought it makes so much sense to have that. And this is the night that Evin prison was on fire. I remember that night very well, and it was also when the police attacked Sharif University, and it was really hard to watch all of these because they were all my friends, whether inside the Sharif University or in Evin prison. And these are images of the smokes of fire and the fire. These are in Tehran. I think just looking at the smoke of the fire was so emotional to me because, as I said, I think the fire and the smoke, it holds all the dreams that young Iranians have, that we have, and we are fighting for. This is in Bandar Abbas, a city in the south of Iran. And these are all around the country. Some of them are screenshots from videos, some of them are photos, some of them are screenshots from my video calls with my friends and family. And these are people making cocktail Molotov. Yeah, and I was I think looking at those images and spending so much time, because I ended up making 350 prints, which means 1,050 times of the act of doing the handprint. So I had to spend a lot of time just gazing at these images. And I was always questioning what happens to Iranians, like what happens, because we were being fed by all these images, and this was our lives. And at some point it was normal to me to look at a person on fire. And then I slowed down the process a little, and I started just collecting, just looking for the characters that I found in the prints, and try to tell the story maybe in a different way. So I remember when I was in Iran, I used to always just talk to the carpet weavers, the gelim weavers, and felt makers, and how a carpet is like an open story that you can read however you want, and there are symbols that the weaver puts in the carpets. They're their wishes, they're their hidden messages, they're what they want, and they're what they want to tell. So this is an ongoing project. The next step is I'm going to make a big carpet, a felt carpet piece that I hope it's a good ground to have the fire, the rhythm that I want in it, to just, hold the memories and the wishes that we all have for our future Iran. That's it.
Thank you so much, Paria. Now it is with great pleasure that I would love to invite our panelists to the stage in order to kick off the panel discussion we have planned for you. So Dr. Nahid Siam-Doust is an assistant professor in Middle East Studies and Media Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Her work focuses on Middle Eastern cultural production and politics, Iranian national and transnational culture and media, social media, and disinformation. She's the author of The Soundtrack of the Revolution, The Politics of Music in Modern Iran, and the host of a new podcast series on women, life, freedom, all in Iran. Dr. Monad Tajali is an associate professor of international relations and women's and gender and sexuality studies at Agnes College. Her work falls within the field of comparative politics, Middle East studies, and women's studies. She's the author of Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, and a co-author of Electoral Politics, Making Quotas Work for Women. Most recently, as I briefly shared with you, she's been working on an Iran Women's Bill of Rights with the Iranian Feminist Collective for Women, Life and Freedom. Last but not least, Dr. Kian Tajbakhsh is a senior, got some fans in the audience, many I'm sure, is a senior advisor at Columbia Global Center, Columbia University. He works on university-wide initiatives focusing on global migration, is the coordinator of the Committee on Forced Migration, and a fellow and professor of international relations. He is the author of Creating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization, as well as several other texts and media articles. His very early essay in this recent movement, called Iran's First Feminist Uprising, about Mahsa Amini and the protests, has been cited widely. Welcome to the stage. And as we're, go ahead. And as we're conducting our panel discussion, we're just going to have a very slow, subtle slideshow behind us that is just there. It is images of Iranian life, pre and post-revolution, inside and outside, just to give a bit of an insight or a glimpse into everyday Iranian life that's very difficult to see outside of the Iranian context. So that's why that's there. Thank you. Everyone, sorry that I couldn't sort of greet you directly as I was speaking, but really lovely to have you here. Thank you for joining us. To kick us off, I would just love to go around and ask each of you if there are any initial reflections or thoughts that you would like to share with us, both based on what's been shared tonight, but also in general in terms of what's going on. Starting with you,
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here for this event. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much, Panijan, for organizing and for all the other organizers and all the beautiful art that we've already seen so far. I really appreciated it. And I think maybe I'll actually, use the presentation of art to make a comment about the Woman Life Freedom Movement, which is that it's a very I think it's still a very pregnant moment in that this protest movement, this revolutionary uprising started in September of 2022. And of course, the street protests went on for a few months. They've kind of subsided by now. But what we're now seeing is the real work starting. We're seeing a lot of important statements, important manifestos, chief among them, the one that my esteemed colleague here, Muna Tajalli, is presenting us today. But just today, on International Women's Day, we've seen several other statements also by other groups come out and leading up to this moment. So I think what's been happening is a lot of really important sort of footwork for what shall, for the kind of Iran that we imagine going forward. And the way I would like to sort of, anchor into the art that we've seen so far is that art, affect, emotion, iconography, music, all of these different culture productions have been so much part and parcel of the Woman Life Freedom Movement because this is a movement for life. At the core, it has a politics of life, which is fueled by art and the beautiful things that we humans can create when we are rooted happily within life and sort of countering the politics of death that the Islamic Republic, one might argue, has been sort of pursuing over the last 44 years, in which communality over grief, over sacrifice, over death has really become much more the kind of affect that the state has used to really create community. And so, art goes very much to the core of the issue of life. And so thank you very much for the beautiful art. And maybe I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. And again, thank you to dear Pani, to Robin, to the team as a whole for holding this really, really important event and also allowing us to celebrate International Women's Day in such a gathering, right? In the sense, and I definitely want to echo what Nahi-Jan already mentioned, in the sense that we have these gatherings, we have these days in order to bring groups together, in order for us to actually be able to talk about and exchange experiences and create dialogue around some of the key aspects or key things that are sort of present at the moment. And so one of the things that I'm really grateful for is having this opportunity, having this space. I'm a big fan of transnational exchanges, so although many of us are here in New York City, which is a fantastic place to be, but also many of us can discuss and talk about and really relate to what's happening on the streets of Iran, in Iran at the moment, in terms of politics. Many of us have sort of personal connections. Many of us are here in the diaspora. Many of others may not even be Iranians, which goes back to what Melanie was mentioning in her remarks, in the sense that there is a moment for solidarity, right? There's a moment for us to really try to recognize, how can I show my support to this liberatory movement, to this revolutionary, radical movement that's happening? And yes, International Women's Day is one of those great opportunities to be able to do this. I think art, music, all of these allow us to, again, engage with one another and really focus on some of the commonalities that we hold, even though we might be talking about a distant land, right? Even though we may not fully understand the complexities of Iranian politics and society, and I think you did such a fantastic job to try to boil that down to us in just 15 minutes, it is really complicated. It is, there's so many moving parts that's happening, so I'm very grateful to this opportunity to be able to talk about it. There's going to be a lot more remaining questions for us to discuss and get into, so I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So again, thank you for allowing this opportunity.
Well, I'd like to also thank all of you for coming out this evening, and I'd like to thank Pani and Robin and the other members of the team, and I'd like to add a personal note. this is especially meaningful for me to be on this stage this evening because, as Mary and others know, well, first of all, I'm very proud to be here on this stage because I'm a former faculty member here at the New School. And I should tell you that years ago when I was a graduate student, this is a personal note in thanks to the New School, when I was a graduate student in New York City, somebody asked me, when you graduate, where do you think you would most like to teach? And I said, well, the New School for Social Research. And I was very fortunate several years later to be able to have that privilege and opportunity. So I'm back somewhere which is very close to my heart. I have a lot of friends and colleagues. And I would just say that I think it's very fitting that the New School, which has a tradition going back to the early parts of the 20th century for social activism and for supporting movements for social justice and for equality and for other forms of progress in society, it's very fitting that the New School has put on this event tonight to show solidarity with people, with men and women across, in a country very far away, which speaks to its international orientation, which we heard in some of the introductory remarks. So I think it's a call out for the New School, and it gives me a special pleasure to be here personally. In terms of this evening, I look forward to the conversation, and I should also say I would like to congratulate International Women's Day to all the women here, including my daughter and my wife, who are sitting here and who have been very kind to take time out of their schedules to come this evening, and to all of the women here, and of course in Iran, who deserve our attention and our solidarity. So I look forward to the conversation this evening, and I should say I'm also very proud to be with an old friend, Nahid, and meet new friends, Mona, scholars who are all contributing to important aspects of understanding Iran.
Thank you so much. I think we've sort of touched on why this uprising feels so different than those in recent years, but I think it would be really wonderful to hear your specific take, each of you, if you have something to share with regards to why you think this particular uprising feels different.
Thank you very much to my colleagues and to Kyonjan. Yes, it's great to be here and to be on the same stage with you. So I think there's a real maturity that we see in this movement that is very different from what we've seen. Iranians have been going through uprisings and revolutions for over a century. You heard in Pani's beautiful presentation, chief among them the 1906 constitutional revolution, where they overthrew an absolute monarchy, then 1979, where they overthrew a constitutional yet dictatorial monarchy for an Islamic revolution. And then, of course, in the last 44 years, we've had some very monumental uprisings, chief among them 2009 and the recent uprisings over the last few years. But I think, in terms of sort of, if we were to anthropomorphize Iran and look at it as a sort of, being coming of age, it's been a long process of coming of age, but it almost feels like the coming of age is sort of completing, in that there's a real maturity that we see in this movement because of the century-long attempts of, trying to achieve freedom and democracy and justice, and really at every turn, sort of being defeated by one thing or another, international, national, all kinds of factors that have, religion, all kinds of factors that have bled in to ultimately prevent the kind of outcome that Iranians have been seeking. And I think what we see in this movement is a sort of crystallization, a kind of clarity that I believe was missing, at least in the 1979 revolution, when Iranians had a phenomenal uprising to achieve democracy, to finally rid themselves of the yoke of a dictator, and achieve the kind of the kind of world that was being imagined in the 70s, which was anti-imperial, transnational solidarities pouring into Iran and really lauding it for being in that moment and yet failing at it, in part because of reasons that maybe we can discuss. They're complicated, but ultimately, I think you called it a power grab by the Islamists, but the charismatic leader, Khomeini, ultimately taking the lead on that. And I think this movement is different because, as opposed to something else that you referred to in your introduction, whereby, Iranians for decades, they kind of, and some of the analyses we see now are kind of ahistorical and take things out of context, but basically the reason Iranians did try to achieve reforms and democracy through the Islamic Republic were in part because, let's not forget the invasion of Iraq, right? 2003. So Iran was at the receiving end of potentially having a foreign invasion. And so Iranians were really trying to sort of, ward that off and make do within, internally, try to bring about those reforms. And at this point, I think all those attempts have been fruitless. Iranians have tried all kinds of, ways of trying to reform the system from within. They have had the dictatorial monarchy. They have had, the Islamic Republic. And there's this real clarity in this movement whereby Iranians know that what kind of future government they want. At the basis of it is one that is not ruled by Islamist politics, that's for sure, right? Islam will no longer have a role to play in any kind of future Iran once we've transitioned beyond the Islamic Republic. And another is, by the same token, that they're looking for a secular democracy. Now, what kind of shape that takes, of course, there have been lots of discussions. We've seen opposition groups come about, both outside and internally. We've seen lots of very important collectives come about and issue manifestos and statements, many of them from prisons, Nargis Mohammadi and Bahar Hidayat, many of them women. But I think there are just certain things that are very clear this time around.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to echo everything that Nahijan mentioned. And in a sense, what's happening right now, or what's been happening since September of 2022, is a continuation of what we've been seeing in terms of the mass struggles, in terms of the protests. I wouldn't even say decades long, I would probably say even centuries long, in the sense that we're talking about a population, just like anywhere else, who have obviously have been struggling for democracy, for human rights, for gender equality, for equality, social justice. And so this is nothing new. So what we're seeing right now is nothing new. The fact that women, again, are also at the forefront is also not new, because again, we're talking about a population that, as Nahijan put it, is quite aware, is really prepared, is mobilized, is politicized. It has 44 plus years of experiencing discrimination, injustice, violence, oppression in various shapes and forms and across different intersectional identities. So we're talking about a population that has very good understanding and knowledge of what it needs. And so definitely it's been sort of chipping away at those power structures, at those sort of systems of oppression. This is how I talk about it to my students. It's like there's systems of oppression. It's not just one, it's multiple, and they're sort of overlapping with one another. So in that case, it's a continuation. How is it different? Yes, it's also quite different in the sense that this is one of those moments where that intersectional aspect is actually quite highlighted, and I consider that to be one of the successes of the Iranian women's movement, in the sense that so as the preamble of the Iran Women's Bill of Rights mentioned, the first mass protest against the theocracy was women-led. And that was in 1970, March 8th, exactly 44 years ago, where women poured into the streets and they said, hey, this is not what we revolted for, right? We wanted democracy, we wanted human rights, we wanted social justice. What we're hearing is actually trying to take away some of the rights that we had previously fought for decades to bring about, such as the very important family law that was there. So the rumors were there, and women poured into the streets. There's a great documentary on YouTube by the French journalist who was there at that protest, asking women, hey, what are you nervous? And they actually just clearly outlined, they're like, we're nervous that this is headed in the way that we didn't sign up for. But then what ended up happening on that same day is that protest was crushed by men. It was crushed by other revolutionary forces. And so women felt alone, right? And again, and when you look into the data that we have, they were actually told, some of the Marxist groups, some of even those groups that were promising democracy and justice, they were like, just be patient, to the women, just be patient, it'll come, right? Let's allow the new state to form, and it'll come. This is why I'm saying it's a success, that now finally we're seeing those other sections of the society are recognizing that in fact what women have been pushing for and fighting for is part and parcel with the larger demands for democracy and human rights. You cannot separate asking for gender equality and social justice without, asking for. So I think in that sense, I think calling it maturity is a really good way of articulating, is that finally we recognize that asking for women's rights does not mean that you're undermining men's rights or anything else. And that's why the manifesto that we've put forward is really talking about feminism. It's putting out clearly in black and white what are some of the key demands, and that let's not tell women or large sections of this population or other marginalized populations to be patient, but rather say, no, these are the demands. The ground has been laid for us through decades of previous organizing. We are prepared. We want to see these become reality in the future Iran. We want this Bill of Rights to then become part of the Iranian constitution. Whatever shape or form that will take, these are some of the fundamental things that we're asking for. We're asking for gender equality. We're asking for social justice, equal access to education, where students are not violated or they're not seeing violence the way we're seeing at the moment. These are some fundamental things that regardless of ideological differences, Iranians are on the same page. And I think this process of us putting together this bill is really eye-opening, that some of these fundamental demands are clearly there. We just need to work towards them to make them become a reality.
I would echo some of these comments that Mona said, and I would emphasize both the continuities and the discontinuities in terms of what is distinctive. I think in this respect we can point to the fact that although it is true that this, what I call the first feminist uprising, builds on decades, many decades of women's movements in Iran, as we've seen or we've heard already. I think there was something distinctive having to do with the fact that it took place under the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is to say, there was something both general about the demands for women's rights, but there was also something specific. And one way to frame this is to use an expression that political scientists use, or in the study of politics, about an authoritarian bargain. Up to now, and the point I want to make is I think that the young women who led the movement from September on, September 2022, and the young men that followed them and supported them, they, in a sense, broke a taboo which had been dominant. It wasn't exclusive in the Islamic Republic, but it had been dominant up to that point, which is you might call an authoritarian bargain. That is to say that there is some kind of deal that is made between authoritarian states and the citizenship in which citizens accept the essentially authoritarian nature of the state, which is to say it is not democratically accountable in the terms that we're used to in the West, but that the authoritarian state provides two basic kinds of goods in exchange for the fact that citizens accept the authoritarian ruling system, which basically means without revolting, right? Without launching a massive revolutionary kind of uprising. The first one is money, welfare, goods, which it could be cash transfers, it could be welfare. In other words, the authoritarian state agrees to give amounts of money to certain sections of the population that demand it, and then they recede. Then the second good that the authoritarian state gives is some kind of participation in policy making, a little bit. They don't make themselves accountable in a fully pluralistic political system in which they can lose elections and lose power through elections, but they allow a very small amount of policymaking participation by certain groups. I think that up to 2022, this described a lot of the back and forth between what was going on in Iran. I mean, this is a controversial position, and I'd be very happy to hear qualifications to it. But let's say in 2019, when the rural working class led street protests against economic austerity and poverty, the government was able to provide some monetary compensation after, of course, there was physical repression. But I think that what happened in 2022 is that these young women broke this authoritarian bargain. I think it was a moment where they stepped beyond the taboos that I was used to working in. And I say this as someone who was in Iran from around the year 2000 to 2016. And, you know, there was a kind of, it wasn't that we accepted the authoritarian regime, it's that we were forced to do that. And we were forced to work on the terms that the regime put down. But I think that what happened is this was a taboo-breaking moment. I think it's incredibly courageous, these young women and the young men that you know, supported them. In a sense, it seemed to me that they would no longer tolerate the terms of this authoritarian bargain and saying we want something new. And I think that what is distinctive about this particular uprising is that these young women and these young men, they threw down the gauntlet to the regime and to the Iranian society, and I think that's important, not just to the regime, but to Iranian society, a new vocabulary, a new grammar of individual rights and dignity that is now a challenge. It's sort of on the agenda, it's on the table. The regime obviously is not going to respond to it in a conciliatory way, but I think that what is very distinctive is that they have thrown this new vocabulary onto the agenda of Iranian society, and it's a challenge that both society and regime are going to have to deal with in the decades to come.
I would, if I may just chime in, I would agree with most of what you said, Kyunjan, except for that I don't believe, I think the reason women did throw down the gauntlet and did break, you know, whatever semblance of an agreement there was because they were actually never full participants in that authoritarian bargain. So sure, they were also the beneficiaries of, you know, some of the, you know, the social welfare system that the state has in whatever shape, and this is again also a contested issue. But at the end of the day, when it comes to political participation, women were actually never full participants of that bargain. And in fact, I think what we saw is the people who were the most marginalized, the women, the minorities, they were the ones who ultimately gathered the courage to confront the system because for them, there was less to lose in the end than there was for the people who were full participants to the bargain, whether it's men or, you know, people who, in some ways, had benefited from being part of the, you know, state structure or still thought they had some buyout in reforming the system from within. Although I would say even that had really terminated long before this happened. I think that kind of notion that there was still some stake at, you know, that people could have a stake within the system to reform things from within, that they did have this authoritarian bargain to still, you know, participate. I think that really kind of came to an end, you know, fully with the election of Ebrahim Raisi. You could still say that, you know, with the election of the second election of Rouhani in 2017, people came out. They still wanted to, you know, choose the more centrist candidate versus a more hardline one. I forget who the state favorite was at the time. I think it was like Saeed Jalili, if I'm not mistaken, the you know, nuclear negotiator. Super hardline conservative. But with Ebrahim Raisi, the most engineered elections in the history of the Islamic Republic, where really there was no longer any kind of pretense that anything could be reformed, I think it became clear that there was no such bargain really anymore in place. And maybe we can talk about this. And I just want to say, the fact that it was the most marginalized, the groups who had been the most cut out, that ultimately brought this challenge to the system. This is also reflected in the music. So I think in the protest, because that's part of my research, but in the protest we see it's the women, it's the minorities. In the music, we see the greatest challenges, rhetorically and musically, also coming from women and from rappers and hip-hoppers who, so I think this was in many ways a movement that was led by those who had been cut out. And very quickly, everybody else realized that they also had a huge stake in this because of what Mona John also referred to before, which is that there was this moment where it was understood that unless there was liberty for women, there couldn't be liberty for anyone, true liberty, right?
Are you interested in dialogue?
Thank you. I'm really open to go with the flow. Go for it.
If you permit me, I'm going to make a very brief response, only because of many conversations I've had with my wife around this issue. And not to disagree with you, Nadia John, but just to say that I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the reality for many middle-class professional women in Iran over the last 20 years, even though it's been an Islamist, patriarchal legal system, has been not as dire as some people would think if they compare it to places like Afghanistan. Middle-class professional women in Iran have been managers, they've been business owners, they've been engineers, they've been deputy ministers, they own businesses. They are, in fact, quite integrated in a lot of the professional class. And I think that I only say this to say that when you look at 2022 and you ask how many of those let's call them middle-class, middle-aged, urban, professional women have gone out on the street in support of the young women, you typically will find it's very few. So the question is, I think there is one question is, why then do these young women, and remember, most of the protests since 2022 have been among a young generation between the ages of 15 and 16 and their late 20s. And I'd be happy to talk about the possibilities about how it can or cannot expand. But I think this was just a point to say that I think it's important to highlight the fact that despite the restrictions of the Islamic Republic, many middle-class professional women in Iran have had actually some of the most participation in the private sector, in some of the public sector, than many countries in the Middle East. And I think that's an important context to understand the distinction and the uniqueness of the current
I'll take a quick issue with you mentioning deputy ministers. No,
I can actually merge these two conversations very well if I'm allowed. So yes, I'm actually going to draw from my research. So my research is specifically on women's political participation and representation. And yes, we have had, so within the extremely limited structures of Iran, we're talking about an authoritarian regime, we're talking about where there's no free and fair elections, we're talking about a context in which you actually have a body, an institution that's non-elected, that actually vets candidates to make sure that they can allow. So even within these very closed structures, we've had absolute agency and maneuvering of women and women's rights groups to be able to find the ways to say, hey, polygamy is something that we all disagree with. Let's make sure it doesn't pass in the parliament because of the fact that it repeatedly comes up by the extremists and so on and so forth. So yes, they have had really remarkable successes despite the extreme limitations. However, going back to what Nahijan was mentioning is that every single time that we saw a little bit movement forward, there was then 10 steps back. What do I mean by this? So for instance, the 2016 Parliament, which I studied in depth and I've even devoted large sections of my book to, is talking about sort of how did women, the secular women's movements, the reformist women's movements, they launched a major campaign which was called Change the Male-Dominated Face of Parliament, and they asked for a few things. One of them was, let's make sure women's numbers for candidacy increases, and then the second thing they asked is, like, let's make sure that women that enter into politics are actually have a gender understanding. Maybe they'll become sort of representatives of women. And within those very limited confines, they actually managed to get few of these women into the parliament, who I call in my research critical actors. Women that actually, for instance, when the acid throwing was happening, were like, oh my God, this has no room in our society. Let's put a bill, let's talk about it. What happened in the next round of elections? The exact outspoken women were then disqualified to run for politics. So that's where you have a movement that's saying, we tried our best for 40 plus years to find a way to say, polygamy doesn't have a place in our society. Acid throwing doesn't have a place for our society. I'm sure today many are saying, you know, gassing school-age children doesn't have a place in our society. And yet, what we see over and over again, the limited tolerance on behalf of the ruling elites of any challenges to the status quo, that even when you have individuals rise from within, and I think it's important to give credit to these individuals who are learned religious individuals, who do come from the Islamic Republic, who do realize that there's something fundamentally unjust and undemocratic and against gender equality, and yet there's very little movement to be able to push for this. So I think definitely Raisi's presidency was yet another moment where Iranians realized it's a lost cause. And that's why we had an extensive campaign to boycott the elections. So I actually study the numbers of elections. And I also study why, you know, when people actually boycott elections. In the previous two rounds of elections, the 2022 elections for the parliament, as well as the 2021 elections for the presidency, we had a major campaign be launched on boycotting elections. Women boycotted 2 to 3 percentage points higher than men did. And usually women are just as equal level. So that's where you see the level of political understanding and sort of maturity among these groups. It's just higher because they have a lot more to lose. And they've seen it over and over again, what happens even when you do try to have these really important successes, but still they end up becoming, not major successes.
Thank you. So kind of moving ahead with regards to what you've been saying, you know, at the risk of asking a simplistic question, but then seeking to complicate it, what do the Iranian people want and how unified are they? And now I can open it up to whoever would like to go first. It doesn't have to be, yeah. What do they want and how unified are they?
Yeah, okay, so yes, I just wanted to hear, open it up with regards to what do Iranians want. I mean, I've already spoken a lot, and I think all of us agree with the fact that the ground has been laid. The ground has been laid through decades of organizing. Iranians are very politically savvy. They're very politicized population, despite the extensive sort of surveillance and despite the extensive sort of lack of freedom of expression or freedom of media. They're really good at really knowing, you know, who's saying what and what's doing what, and particularly among the youth, right? Particularly, we're talking about a very important population. So I think recognizing this, what we did, which is the Hambude Feministi Iran, or the Iran Feminist Collective for Women, Life, Freedom, what we did is to really try to outline some of these in the black and white. So the website is www.iwbr.org. It's unfortunately already been filtered in Iran. It got filtered within the first 2 hours. But tech-savvy individuals are really good because now the images of the document are being circulated on Twitter. So we were told to just take images of it, and it's being. So I just wanted to mention a few things of what this Bill of Rights is. First of all, we called it a bill, a layehe, versus a manshur or a charter, because we have had charters in the past, and there are important charters coming. Whereas a bill is one thing that is aimed aimed to then eventually be enshrined into the national constitution. So we really wanted to say that demands have already been set by many different groups. It's important to pay attention to these demands. It's important to study them. It's important to have a dialogue around them. Let's also have a dialogue around what do we want to see legally be put in place. So the bill actually has 20 articles. The 20 articles include things like right to education, women's access to the labor market, access to justice, political representation, political participation, love and union, and so on and so forth. So I really want to encourage you all, particularly the Iranians, to really read and engage with this particular document. The collective, we call ourselves a collective because it's not an organization. It was individuals who identified as feminists. We do not all agree with one another, but we really realize that given the fact that there's been such an important work done on this, it's important for us to come together to start the conversation, to start a dialogue. The bill that has been published is published as a living document. What that means is that it's one that is meant to be dynamic. It's one to start the conversations and the dialogues among the different sections of the society. It's a women's Bill of Rights because, again, we do recognize that women have been dealt the shorter end of the stick for so long, so it's important to have that gender perspective, but it's meant to also have that intersectional feminist lens in the sense that we realize there's no monolith of any social group, any identity. Even us here, there's no monolith among our population, and I'm sure with your student body or anywhere else. So it's important to take into account these intersectional identities. We are getting a lot of inspiration from other manshurs or other manifestos, other charters that have been published. This is yet another one that is specifically calling itself a Women's Bill of Rights with regards to recognizing the extent to which some of the oppression is quite gendered. I think what we're seeing happening with regards to the schools in Iran is such a catastrophic, but at the same time eye-opening moment where you see in a land where right to education is supposed to be so much valued, it's the girls' schools who's being attacked, right? Yes, sure, they threw in one high school, I think, one boys' high school they threw in to be like, no, but you see the extent of gendered violence. So no longer can we turn a blind eye to these sort of gendered ways of oppression, and I think even here in the United States, we're very aware of what racism, what sexism, what all these things can do. So that's another reason to be able to really talk to one another, really dialogue, really have this exchange of experiences across borders as well. If I think of anything else that I wanted to share with regards to the bill, but yeah, feel free to ask me questions about it and all that. It took months to get it to this shape. We specifically wanted to launch it on March 8th, 2023. So I'm really proud that New School has been able to allow this.
Very, very exciting, and I'm sorry that I had to cut a few of the sentences out. I had way too much material for 15 minutes. But I wonder if you don't mind holding up the back of your program with the little, it's got a little QR code. So that QR code, if you're interested in more information, it's a live Google Sheet, and we're going to basically be sharing all this information. We'll share, the bill, and also it'll be a live document. You can put in your links to like information, organizations that we can support and so on. So I just wanted to alert you to that and direct you to that. Would anybody else like to speak to what do the people want and how unified are they?
Sorry, I did want to give a credit to Paria Ahmadi. I wrote this sentence of hers when she was up here. She said, all the dreams that Iranians have and are fighting for, right? So I think that for me that just solidified what we're talking about here. That those images that she was getting through social media, through her family, it's those dreams are very clear. We know what we want. Now we're fighting for them. Yes, fire, smoke, all of these things are really strong symbolism that this is not something ambiguous that Iranians just suddenly are coming up with. That's what I'm saying, like this Bill of Rights is not something new. It's been in the works for decades. Now we just compiled it together based on the decades of, what the previous work had been done.
Maybe I'll walk it back a little bit and sort of take it into a more poetic place, or just sort of what we've seen online on social media in terms of, thank you so much, Mona, and congratulations on your collective. And I think I printed it out today. It's 15 pages, and it's great text, and it's super well researched, and it goes to the core of a lot of the demands that have also been made by other groups. So there's real unity on on most of these items that you have in your manifesto or Bill of Rights. So if what do Iranians want? They want, when we look at social media and the kinds of images that are, circulated so many times, a lot of it is really about this sort of, it is about joy and life. It's about, we see lots of dancing, we see lots of people singing, we see people sit behind their, steering wheels, actor, and recording themselves talking about their dreams. And this is a very imaginative space, right? People are being very generative about the kind of future that they're imagining. And they're really connecting sort of this joyous Iran where people get to dance freely. We've seen all these videos of, Khoda Noor, for example, the Baluchi guy who was killed, of him dancing so joyfully to Baluchi music. After the death of Mahsa Jina Amini, we've seen videos come out of her dancing at parties. So we see sort of very actively this posting of, this discursive or rhetorical space where there are these Iranians who are engaging in that happy space, fighting a state that is denying them a sort of very basic happiness, which is why the song Baraye, Shervin Hajipur's Baraye, which won a Grammy this year, the first time that a song was nominated for an award in social justice. The song really encapsulates it all, right? It was a song that was composed from tweets that Iranians posted to the Twitter hashtag Baraye, for the sake of. And in the song, we see it's for an ordinary life, it's for dancing in the streets, it's for smiling faces, it's for life. And what's interesting about the fact that you chose the fall of Zahak for this event is that they are then connecting sort of this joyous life, this free life to their Persian culture, to an idealized Persian culture for sure, right? But ultimately presenting Zahak, who in the Shahnameh is a character from a king who invades Iran and is from outside of Iran. We know in the Shahnameh he's Arab. So there, every now and then on the edges of these discourses, there are certainly xenophobic, sort of anti-Arab sentiments, and I think we need to be very careful of that. But at the end of the day, those are sort of disassociated because we also see a lot of, pretty much all, this is also a very intersectional, minority inclusive movement. So we see people in Iran shouting out to the Baluchis shouting out to the Kurds. So there's a real sense that this is an Iran that's a patchwork of many different ethnicities and languages, and that's the future that Iranians want, a future in which Iran can embrace its diversity and its beautiful, beautiful colors. And so we see this then in the kinds of social media posts where that kind of Iran is connected to an Iran that is then freed from Zahak, from this sort of evil serpent king by freedom fighters. And so really connecting that to this Persian mythology and the pre-Islamic past, I think has been very prominent in all of these discourses.
Well, I have to commend, first of all, I want to commend Mona on the Bill of Women's Rights. I look forward to reading it. I think what I'd like to just add to this conversation, let's say, adding to the idealistic and the poetic, I think we should also add some of the realism. When you ask a question, what do Iranians think? One question is whether one can speak of Iranians as a whole speaking in a single voice. So here, of course, the way real societies are is that there are differences and there are different groups that want different things. And of course, in the real world of politics, numbers count. And so obviously in Western political systems, we use majority rule as a best approximation to speak of the people, but even there you have minorities and you have dissenters. So let's look at Iran. A few years ago, I wrote an essay called What Are Iranians Dreaming About? And what I did there is I tried to distinguish, as I saw it, three basic groups about what Iranians could aspire to in terms of a vision of the future of the country. These three groups are the Islamists, let's say the moderate nationalists, and what I call, so the first group are the Islamists, like the ruling group currently, who support a authoritarian, dictatorial Islamic regime to impose Sharia law on the rest of society. There is a second group, which could be the moderate Islamic Democrats and some nationalists who support an attempt to combine and synthesize forms of accountability and Islamic tradition. And the third group are secularists and Republicans, either of a monarchical or a purely Republican group. I think that Iranians, an individual Iranian in the world today, I mean, when they look out on the ideological possibilities of the future of Iran, I would suggest that these are the three kind of baskets that they would have to choose from. I could be wrong, there could be four, there could be five, but basically there isn't a single basket. Now, to put a bit of context in this, how do we know what Iranians think, Iranians as a whole? First of all, there's 80 million Iranians inside Iran, and there's maybe, I don't know, 1 million outside. But let's look at the Iranians inside. From all we can tell, the best sort of analysis, experience, surveys, looking at the experience of support for different political parties over the last 30, 40 years, we can estimate about 15% of the population support the current regime. 15%. That's 7 or 8 million people. And if that's the case, then there are a large group of Iranians who support the current regime. They support imposing Islamist law on the rest of the population without their consent. They support a patriarchal, discriminatory gender system, which is built into the Constitution. Now, where do the other percentages come from? We can make estimates, and of course it's a very hard thing to do. There are surveys, they're very unreliable. It's very hard, obviously, in a closed society without freedom of expression to gauge the public opinion. But I would just say that this is one point to keep in mind. And in another essay that I wrote more recently, I suggested that what we're seeing in the future is going to be some version of an Iranian culture war, because there are significantly divergent opinions on some basic cultural issues, for example, having to do with hijab. I personally think the majority reject mandatory hijab. I personally believe that's the case.
Surveys. You don't have to personally believe that. Even under the Rouhani government, they did a survey. The government itself did a survey, and 79% or so were against mandatory hijab.
Right, but remember, the context is an authoritarian government that does not respond to public surveys. I mean, the point of Iran, the Iranian law, is that it doesn't respond to the fact that majorities support it or don't support it. I mean, I support it and you support it. I'm just saying the question, and this brings up the question of the transition, how to get from now to where Mona's ideal, which I think we all support, wants to get to. But that's a different question of strategy, that's a question of political transition. But in terms of this general question, I would just say that we should put it in the context of divergent interests, divergent ideologies, beliefs, values, and even if there is a minority, there is the one law, Mona, that I learned in political science that I think I could take away with was a classic law which said, organized minorities are more powerful than disorganized majorities. And this is an issue in Iran where you have very intense preferences of a small group of minority of people who are willing to use state power to impose their values on the rest of society. That's where we are. And, but it's still the case that in a future scenario, those people are not going to go away. They're not going to emigrate. You're going to have to somehow integrate those beliefs into a new consensus, a new reconciliation. But that's something we can talk about in future.
Hyunjin, I give you the 15%, but in terms of the middle group, the second group that you mentioned, not the secular, I think basically the catchphrase for them would be the reformists, right? They're trying to find some kind of way of reforming the system, of melding Islam and democracy. That group has practically disappeared. And even their own leader, Mir Hossein Mousavi, who's been under house arrest since 2009, about 3 or 4 weeks ago issued a letter saying, I no longer believe that this system can be reformed from within. I believe that we need to have a constituent assembly and a new constitution. So even their leader has said that this system is no longer to be reformed from within. So what I want to say is that I believe that, I think these groups that you referred to, they're very much in flux. One of them is practically sort of disappearing by the day. The reformists have lost their legitimacy with the Iranian people. They have lost sort of, their claim to being able to reform things because they haven't managed to reform anything. And if anything, the state has gotten more, conservative, more securitized, conservative in terms of allowing political participation. Not, we can see on the streets that people through everyday acts have pushed the boundaries. So when I'm just talking about political participation allowed by the system. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I feel like what you just said, sort of counters this notion that there is some kind of clarity and understanding about the kind of future that Iranians imagine, because you're mentioning these groups and you're saying, well, it's really dissipated by, these different. And I would argue that actually it's now becoming more and more sort of these two groups, right? The state supporters, the pro-regime actors, the ones who have a stake in the regime financially, politically, in every other way, 15%, maybe 20%, right? But I would say that for most others, they are more and more moving into sort of the other side together. That's my understanding.
We're so rapidly running out of time, but I was just going to say, if we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if you have a burning one, and while we get you ready, if you put your hand up, I'm going to just open it back up, and maybe, I know you have a comment to make. Maybe just go questions? Yeah. Okay, but maybe we can think about also what might be an ideal scenario, given this conflict, given the possible differences in groups, what could be an ideal scenario? What would be an ideal scenario?
I'm just going to make a very quick point. So when it came to putting the Bill of Rights together, we asked ourselves this question a lot, where do we want to outline the demands of women's groups, feminist groups, where we know it won't seem too idealistic, or do we want to truly just outline our demands? And through our discussions, because we are talking about a patriarchal society, we are talking about where conservative gender ideology has been dominating, and obviously, right, like everybody knows about this. So then it became of, are we then going to censor ourselves? Are we then going to limit ourselves of not imagining that ideal future just because we know we have so many constraints? So just on behalf of the collective's thought process was, no, we're not going to censor ourselves. We're going to put together the ideals. Why? Because we're talking about a society that is definitely not a monolith. Culture of Iran is not static. It's dynamic. This is the same country that produced individuals like Maryam Mirza Khani, that produced Shirin Ebadi, but at the same time is poisoning school-age children, right? So which one are we? Are we going to say, well, there's poisoning of schoolgirls, children happening? Like, how are you then talking about non-gender binary language to be included in your bill? It's like, no, well, we also know that there's so much room, and in fact, the youth, because they're at the forefront, they're much more prone, they're much more globalized, and they know what these demands are. So I think just with regards to, so we decided to not talk about it that ideals, but allowing ourselves to imagine that future that is going to be radically different, where anybody even thinking about poisoning school-age children would just be obviously investigated and persecuted, not the way the protesters the 4 individuals who were executed were literally just after 70 days of their arrest, they were found and they were persecuted and they were arrested. And these poisoning of schoolgirls has been happening since November, and just now maybe they're arresting a few people, which we don't even know. So there's the lack of trust. I think all of these things as a factor.
And also the whole notion that that's even now a possibility in Iran. The situation that the state has created, that's even a possibility.
Right.
I don't think that was a possibility in decades ago, and I feel like when I was a kid, I don't think that was the case. Any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the fascinating discussion. I wondered if you could comment on the global dimensions of the current revolution. I'm thinking like a dual question. To what extent, if any, is the current revolution like propelled or fueled by the social revolutions that began in 2019 in Hong Kong, Iraq, Chile, and then, you know, with Black Lives Matter in the US? And what are a corollary, what are the kind of global components of the current revolution? What kind of interplay is there with the global community?
Any thoughts?
I will just very quickly make the comment that one of the things that we know about the protest is that it's leaderless. And that's been that's been one that is quite intentional, because again we're talking about sort of a police state of Iran where it was very easy to take down parties, to put individuals under permanent pretty much house arrest and so on, or political party leaders. So that's something that is a very conscious decision made on behalf of the protesters. And they even said, look at the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a leaderless liberatory movement. Why can't we also intentionally keep it leaderless, while also keeping it leaderless has also allowed it to push forward a quite pluralist sort of agenda and framework, which I think also might address some of Kion's sort of issues, in the sense that pluralism means across diverse sections of society, you do have a place to be able to speak. If you're a complete conservative, religious sort of section of the society, you should have the place to feel that your rights and your beliefs are not being trampled on.
I think, you know, these are movements against the protest movement in Hong Kong against the Chinese government, and other, you know, the protests in Lebanon, for example. These are all movements against rising authoritarianisms around the world, and against conditions of precarity for vast, you know, swaths of people because of the neoliberal conditions that they've, of life conditions, of, you know, not having stability, of, and everything else that we're also experiencing in the United States. And so whether the Iranians were, you know, in 2019 or 2020 again, actually sort of plugged into those movements, I don't think we saw too many references that would make us believe that they were, you know, specifically sort of inspired by these other movements. I think Iranians, to be honest, have been inspired by their own movements for a very long time. They've just had so many uprisings and revolutions over the past century. I don't think any country has had as many. So, you know, 2009 preceded the Arab Spring, and then, of course, they were inspired to see what happened across the Arab world, which, of course, turned into the Arab Winter, as we know. But ultimately, I think the statements of solidarity that we've seen coming from the women of Afghanistan, the women of Sudan, you know, some really strong statements of solidarity for the women of Iran do point to this sort of, you know, transnational sort of network of solidarity. But yeah, I'm not sure there's, yeah.
That's wonderful. So I'm sorry to have to cut this short. I knew I was packing a lot into this program, but such a wonderful and inspiring and really indicative of where we're at also in trying to figure all this out in terms of like, where do we go, where are we coming from, and where do we go? In closing, I would just like to ask if you have any notes. I'm trying to think whether I should ask both of this or whether just to stick with the positive, but do you have any final notes of hope and or caution for us going forward?
I'll just say very quickly. I think, let me start with the bad news first. I think the caution is that I think the possible, well, no, let me start with the positive. I think what the protest, building on all the previous protests, have offered Iranians is a very clear menu of possibilities for the future. I mean, I think it's clear now. I mean, I think especially, I mean, I'm reiterating my sense. I mean, I'm learning from the younger generation. I mean, I say this as someone who worked at what I consider the earlier dispensation. I think that there is there is a clearly a vision of, which with a number of different components having to do with politics, culture, and economics, very positive for the future. I think Iranians it's a maturation, as you mentioned. The caution is that the international situation, the geopolitical situation, is going to make the social movement and revolutionary possibilities in Iran harder, because Iran is aligned now with China and Russia in a new anti-Western, anti-liberal type of alliance, and I think that's just going to make it harder. So I mean, I think the positives are there. I think they need to be built on. I would just say also, if that all the previous movements, if they could add them up, the economic, the cultural, the political, and so forth, we have a recipe for a future movement and a future kind of vision.
Thank you.
Well, I feel like that's what we have in the Women Life Freedom Movement, wouldn't you say? Because labor unions have come together, teacher unions have come together, human rights groups have come together. The charter of the civic organizations and the labor unions, for example. So I think, it's not so much an economic protest movement as it was, let's say, in 2019 or so. But my understanding is that a lot of these threads are coming together, not to the extent that they're destabilizing the state and shutting down the economy. So perhaps that's what you're referring to. What is the
hope or caution?
Yeah, I think I absolutely second Kian in that, unfortunately, Iran is in this very strong pact with Russia and China, two of the strongest authoritarian states in the world, and they've got Iran's back, and so that makes it kind of difficult for Iranians to rise up against their own state. And also, there are other actors in the region. Ultimately, I think my caution there is that Iranians are, although there is transnational solidarity, I think Iranians are on their own because, when you look at the region, it's basically a region housed by authoritarian regimes. And I'm just not sure there are too many actors in the world who have a real stake in a free and democratic Iran. I think that is. But at the same time, I think that Iranians have so much to achieve that great future, which is they've got the human resources, they've got the intellectual capacity, they've got the culture that binds them to rely on, to be able to conjure the kind of imagination that can get them there. They've got, the economic resources if they can themselves be in charge of them. And I think, this movement has been so inspiring, precisely for all of those reasons. So I'm verging towards sort of, a hopeful future, pretty soon, within my lifetime.
Thank you, Nahid.
Yeah, my biggest worry is definitely echoing what my colleagues here have said, but my biggest worry is that the Women Life Freedom slogan, it just remains a slogan versus transforms into becoming a framework of thought and practice. Over and over again, we've seen not just in Iran, but also in the global context where women are active participants of a major transition, major revolution, major things that's happening, and then they're sidelined, right? Or suddenly they're sidelined. So that's my biggest worry where, something major wants to happen and then women are not present substantively, or you have token representation, or other marginalized groups and populations are not present. So that's another thing of why our bill started by talking about that historically women have not had a seat at the table. It's time to make sure women and other marginalized populations have a seat. And also recognizing that our battle will not be done once you have this amazing transition. These battles continue. I mean, here in the United States, right? We're still fighting against racism, sexism, and so on and so forth. So I think this is another thing that we need to recognize, that this is a long-term battle. We are committed, Iranians are committed. We just need support and solidarity from the international human rights community to really be supportive of the Iranian population versus the Iranian state that we know is extremely powerful and has Russia and China.
Thank you so much, Mona. So thank you everyone for being here, and to close the evening for us, I'd like to invite Professor Mary Watson to offer a few concluding remarks.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for an incredible panel. A couple of years ago, the New School celebrated its centennial. It was founded in 1919, and each of the deans were asked at that time to provide something to put into the time capsule of the New School. And I was on that stage today for another event, and I was reminded of that that evening. And what I placed in it was something that a faculty member, Mindy Fullilove, had worked on, which was called the 400 Years of Inequality Project, which traced 1919 back to the founding challenges of 1619, when the first enslaved people arrived in the U.S. So I thought 400 years was a lot, and I learned from Pani tonight that no, it's actually 4,000 years. So 400 years is just a blip in time, because we can travel all the way back 4,000 years in this culture and look at the events that have led to today. So that was really exciting for me. Thank you, Pani, for your tour of that. I want to say that I was also moved and inspired by the music, artistry, scholarship, and poetry of tonight's multimodal event. We'll have another short performance outro in a moment, but I think it really is indicative of the multi-dimensional and multi-fabric sense of challenges that we're seeing in Iran today, and also of the things that can be seen if we take an expanded lens and pull out a bit more. I want to say two things about the New School, just in closing. Those of you who may know about the history of the New School may know that it was founded in 1919, as I said earlier, and you may have heard the names Charles Beard, John Dewey, and James Harvey Robinson, for example, who are often named as the founders, or the founding forefathers, as it were, of the New School. And so I feel an obligation, especially on this International Women's Day, to remind us that the actual truth was not all told at that time. And so a few years ago, the Women's Legacy Project at the New School identified the 10 founding foremothers, and I'd like to read their names in recognition that this stage and this university and the place where you sit today was actually also founded, at least partially, by women. The other thing that we know about the foremothers of the New School is that when they signed the original founding document of the university's Principles of Foundation, they signed under their husbands' names, because that was the custom at the time. So their names were not remembered, because they were remembered as the spouses of their husbands. And so these comments I'm making are really in honor of these women. Mrs. George Haven Putnam, who was restored as Emily James Smith Putnam. Mrs. Leonard Hand, who was restored to Frances Amelia Finke Hand. And then the same for a number of other women, including Dorothy Payne Whitney Straight Elmhurst. Straight and Elmhurst were her married names. Cornelia Solomon Snownick, Carolyn Tilden Bacon, Charlotte Hunwell Sorkin, Ruth Standish Baldwin, Margaret Dreyer Robbins, Katrina Brandis Eli, and Mary Harriman Rumsey. These are the founding foremothers of the university, and I should also add that I have a pin that says, "What would Dorothy do?" Because Dorothy Payne Whitney Straight Helmhurst provided the first funding for the founding of the New School. At that time, it was $15,000 in 1919. So lest we forget that the New School was also at least co-founded and perhaps founded in finance by women, I wanted to mention that tonight. I also I want to say that we have a project at the New School, which is homed in our bachelor's program for adults and transfer students, where Pani is on the faculty. And it's homed by, this is a project called the New Historia, and I want to invite you to contribute to the New Historia. So the New Historia is a project that restores and retells the histories of women and other female-identified people who were forgotten over the course of history. It invites all of you, and it has writers across the world who are writing short histories of women who have been forgotten in the period of history that we've been following. And so you can actually, contact the folks at the New Historia and volunteer to write a history of someone or someone from a certain kind of field, and that will be added to the online archive of the history of women whose names have never been told about. So in that regard, I would certainly invite those of you who are on the panel tonight to think about adding women from this moment to histories. I know we had a movement in after the situation in Afghanistan, to make sure that those memories of women whose voices might not be heard again would be restored, and we certainly would invite you to do the same with these Iranian amazing voices right now. So in closing, I just want to say that the kinds of work that we do at the New School has always been progressive. It's always been focused on the challenging conversations of the day. In fact, in 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. participated in a Race Crisis in America series at the New School, and on this very stage is where that series happened, where you're sitting right now. So there's a history that follows us back. I want to mention Pani's great project, which is called the SexTech Lab, and she'll tell you more about that. It's quite a provocative and interesting space that looks at identities and sexuality and other kinds of behaviors during technology and others, so I invite you to take a look at that. And to visit any of our other centers and institutes, the Milano School of Policy Management Environment, our Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy, the Center for New York City Affairs, the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. We have lots of great events, and please come back and see us again. I also want to thank the Gender and Sexuality Institute at the New School for their support. So this has been, I guess, an event of equal parts celebration, remembrance, and call to action. And this is really a moment of freedom and liberty, building on this long-established feminist movement, as we heard about earlier tonight. It was tried in the 1979 revolution, and as you have said, in many revolutions before then, but when we were unable to reach the full mission of liberation, and yet we continue. This movement, of course, requires many things, but among them is our solidarity. It may start or center a conversation like this one tonight, but it doesn't end here. We have to stand up for those who are harmed and marginalized by the status quo in all of our walks of lives. We have to be allies, and we have to have education and the desire to learn. So in closing, thanks to all of tonight's artists, panelists, and participants. A special thanks to Professor Pani Farvid and her team who brought this event together tonight. If we could have a round of applause for Pani. And now I think the moment is to move to another musical performance by Amir Sanjari, who I think it wasn't mentioned earlier, is currently studying music composition at the Mannes School of Music here at the New School. So over to you, Pani.